thank you for being here. And it's amazing for me to be with David Wallace-Wells, who is one of his book, The Uninhabitable Earth, is a must-read. I was just telling him my daughter's in high school and not only read it on her own, which is wild for me, but she's recommending it to everybody. It's a great way to understand the challenges of climate in our time. I'll say a few things, and then we're going to go back and forth in a sense of conversation. But I begin by saying just moments ago, while we were here, the White House announced that John Podesta is going to be taking over for what John Kerry was doing for the last 3 years as a so-called climate czar. Podesta has been a key figure on climate policy with Barack Obama, but more than that, Podesta probably has almost done more for public lands, wilderness, national forest than anybody. He's been working with the New America Foundation. He's a troubleshooter. We know that he ran Hillary Clinton's campaign, but we'll see how Podesta elevates climate in a presidential election cycle. One of the problems with it is where I teach at Rice University, environmental history, all the students care deeply about climate. And I always worry come fall, whatever debates there are, it gets dropped. It's like a big issue, but then, well, there's war, there's gasoline prices, economy, and it never sometimes is able to stay into the forefront of policy. So I was going to ask you, how did you get started focusing on environmental issues?
Well, let me start by actually picking up on something else you said, which is about the state of climate in our politics. I think that in this cycle, it may be to the benefit of climate campaigners that we are not likely to be so focused on climate change, and that in this election, with the IRA, Biden's big climate bill behind us, there isn't large legislative action sort of on the agenda going forward. And I think when that bill passed, and certainly in the lead up to it, and as people talked about climate policy over the decade between the time that Obama's cap and trade bill failed and this one passed, you heard a lot of anxiety that any Democratic-led effort to make real progress on climate was going to produce a backlash that was going to be really politically dangerous for the party. And remarkably, in the aftermath of the IRA, which is, compared to everything the U.S. has ever done on climate change and decarbonization, it just towers above all those efforts. Remarkably, there's been very little backlash. There was almost no mention of it in the midterms, even though it was passed just a few months before the midterms. It doesn't seem to be a top shelf issue right now for Republicans in criticizing Biden's legacy, even though it was probably it'll end up being something close to $1 trillion bill that really will transform the American energy sector in the space of a decade. And I think there's certainly reasons to hope that more can be done, particularly on the sort of agency action side as opposed to the big budget legislation side. But on some level, I'm kind of happy to see that the climate politics are quiet at the moment, rather than flaring up to a boiling point, which is, I think, something a lot of people feared.
Well, the counter side of that, it would be how bad Biden is in the polls right now, and particularly among young people, and they feel betrayed. They're not reading infrastructure and feeling the climate when then suddenly they start opening up Alaska public lands, and you're having the big fossil fuel president too. And I think a lot of voters are looking for consistency on climate. They've been hidden, obfuscated, bounced around a little, and here Biden, who incidentally had the first climate legislation, for bill, and has this incredible climate record as president. I mean, much better than anybody since we can start recording it. Not going to showcase it. And that becomes a running in politics.
Maybe even negatively showcase it, because he's also in charge of the highest levels of oil and oil and gas production in American history. That may actually be something he talks about more on the campaign trail in his climate record.
And then what happens to those young environmentalists? Will they show up? And they have options. By and large, whatever we call it, I never liked these terms much, but for simple sake, Generation Z, college students or Zoomers or whatever. I've been teaching history since 1989, and I've never seen a group of young college students more downcast about an upcoming election in 2024. They're worried about age of Biden and Trump, but they're feeling just apathetic about things. And so how do we get young people that care about climate really feeling that they can make a difference? And part of it, when I wrote on the 1960s in Sound Spring Revolution, is the idea, as David Brower of the Sierra Club used to say, is you got to have fun saving the planet. On the 60s, there was a sense of fun. When Earth Day kicked in, it was fun, and you were starting to log win, win, win. And when you feel like you've won something, which they did with the big infrastructure bill, but you get more active. And so it all built after Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring in 1962. You then get the birth of Environmental Defense Fund in 67 and Sue the Bastards, and songs like Mercy Me, The Ecology, and Pete Seeger Saving the Hudson, and Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas Stopping Dams, and Stopping It at the Grand Canyon. It started being fun and building a kind of momentum. And if the option is day as, whoa, we're probably better off, don't have fun, just keep it quiet, shush, I don't know how you create a kind of cognizant energy to keep fighting without just lowering morale and lowering voter and young environmental voter turnout.
Yeah, I think that's a real risk. I think it's a risk across the board with Biden. I think that young voters are disappointed, and I think they also don't really know what has been achieved. I mean, I don't have the poll numbers off the top of my head, but it's something like 70% of Americans haven't even heard of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the big ticket climate bill, and it's probably even higher among young voters. So, I think that especially those who worry about climate should know that a major climate bill, and depending on how you want to count the infrastructure bill and the CHIPS Act, maybe even 3 major climate bills were passed under Biden, and they don't, and that is on some level a problem. We'll see how it all plays out. But my own view, which tells the story of my biography a little bit as well, is that it's not just about fun. I mean, I came to the subject, frankly, out of fear. I was a general interest journalist, a magazine journalist. I was an editor mostly at New York Magazine, interested in the near future, interested in science, and just started to see, coming out of the academic research, a lot of really, really worrying, truly kind of alarming projections for where the world would be with warming this century. And the deeper I read into that material and the more that I spoke to scientists who were doing it, it all kind of pieced together to me and made me realize in a way that I never had before that this was not like just one issue among many that you can compartmentalize over here. It really did govern, or at least hover over, everything that we were doing on the planet, because everything that we do on the planet is, takes place under climate conditions. And the changes are happening so quickly, there basically is no historical analog for them. They're happening, half of all the damage we've done has been done in the last 25 years. A quarter of all the damage to the planet's climate future has been done since Joe Biden was elected vice president in 2008. I mean, it's quite rapid destruction that we're doing. And we're just starting to see the real impacts of that arriving in real time the last few years. But we're seeing enough to know that many things that we took for granted about the nature and shape of the planet and the human lives that would be lived on it are being shaken up by these transformations. And when I started seeing that in prospect a few years ago, I found it really destabilizing. I was somebody who was born in 1982, grew up in the 90s. I don't remember a time before I knew about climate change, but I also thought of it as, a problem that would be solved by a global system that was evolving towards ever greater solutions to the problems that had bedeviled humanity for many, many decades or millennia. And I just thought, we're probably not going to solve this, but we're going to make progress in a predictable, reliable way, along with the progress that we're likely to make on poverty and equality and all the rest of it. And the more that I started reading about some of the science 5, 7, 8 years ago now, the more those basic expectations for the future, I don't want to say I totally threw them out, but I started to really question them and wonder how much we could assume that progress would be made on climate and all these other issues. And I wrote a big article, and then I wrote my book from a place of some hope about that, because I thought if there were people like me out there who could be activated, then presumably we could pull some levers a bit harder and change our politics and push them in the direction of climate action. But I also looked back on several decades of political agitation about climate change and didn't see much concrete reason for hope, because it seemed basically like people talked about it. Occasionally there were little burps and flare-ups of concern, but then they dissipate. And the meaningful, large, big-ticket action items that climate activists were really looking for never really happened. And instead, emissions kept growing, global temperatures kept rising, and I wondered just how much, I knew it was a political problem, I knew it was a social problem, but I wondered just how much we could really achieve there. And I wrote the book, it came out in 2019, but I finished it in the fall of 2018, and it was just at a moment of incredible global climate awakening, represented, kind of embodied most by Greta Thunberg, who in the space of a few months from that summer, she started protesting outside Swedish Parliament that summer, 2018, through that spring of 2019, went from being literally a friendless Swedish teenager to the global face of an entire climate movement, inspired millions of climate strikers all around the world to follow her lead and protest in their own countries, even though many of them were underage in non-democracies, some of them queer, ethnic minorities, people who were the farthest you could imagine from halls of political power. She inspired millions of them to come out into the streets. We saw Extinction Rebellion in the UK, Sunrise here in the US, the election of AOC, the talk about the Green New Deal. All of this was actually powered to some significant degree by fear. And it wasn't the only way that all these people were talking about it, and those at that stripe, that corner of the climate movement isn't the full climate movement. But I think to the extent that we have an engaged global youth movement around climate, it's not because climate action has been fun over the last 5 years, it's because young people are really angry and a little bit scared. And so when I think about the rhetorical tools that are used by climate advocates and climate campaigners, and I really do think of myself as a journalist here, not an activist, so I'm looking at it a little bit from a distance. But it seems to me like the obvious answer is that different messages appeal to different people at different times, and probably we need a variety of different ways of talking about this challenge. We need that for a number of reasons, including that it's a very complicated story. You can't actually just tell it one way. It's not just fun, it's not just fear, but it's also not just optimism, it's not just pessimism. It's not, it's very, very complicated, runs in a bunch of different directions all at once. And we need to sort of appreciate that, the scale of that, the complexity of that, both in trying to perceive the shape of the story as it's evolving, and it is evolving, which I hope we can talk about, and also in talking about the urgency of the problem to get people motivated, because there are definitely people out there who want to think we can solve this 100%, and they're disappointed and even angry if you tell them that something like a muddling through is more likely. There are people who are most turned on by technological advancements and social change, and are really, really excited about the positive side of the ledger. But there are other people who are motivated by other things too. Concern for other people elsewhere on the planet, anger about global justice issues, particularly as it intersects with climate. And if you want to get a big tent and you really want to get like a whole green industrial revolution unfolding, which is what we do want, and to some degree what we've already achieved, I think that means talking in a variety of ways to a variety of different people, sensitive to all of the complexity of the story. Mindful that you don't want to talk about the apocalypse, certainly if the apocalypse isn't actually happening, but not forgetting that fear and gloom is also a motivating factor, as I think the experience and example of Rachel Carson shows too.
Yeah, what's the disconnect to me is, why don't you want to be continuing momentum building on a 2024 campaign, and you want it to be subterranean I don't quite understand why you feel that.
Well, I'm not saying that I don't want to have further momentum on climate. I do. I'm saying that I think it's notable that we have not seen the right-wing backlash to major climate action that people expected for a very long time. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that.
We're not getting any Republican senators signing aboard. There used to be a whole host of Republicans. There are none now, so it's become a partisan issue in the U.S.
Yeah, it depends on what history, like how back in time you want to go. But certainly 5 years ago, we wouldn't have gotten any Republican senators. 7 years ago, we wouldn't have gotten any Republican senators. And at that time, if there had been a major, at the end of the Obama presidency, there had been a major effort to do a climate bill, I do think that it would have produced a large-scale culture war backlash, which is not what we're seeing today. And I think part of that is because the transformation of the country's energy systems is already far enough along, and especially far enough along in a lot of red states, that it just doesn't seem like a distant, abstract issue which to stage a culture war fight over. And to the extent that we're thinking of it as a lunch pail issue, the numbers are not, the numbers may point you towards supporting climate action, even if you're a Republican voter.
When you say we, so you're putting on the activist hat.
When did I say we? Sorry, when
you just said we, so you're part of the activist group. You said when we. Do you mean we, the New York Times, or do you mean we?
Who am I speaking on behalf of?
You made it sound like you were part of a group or a movement.
I generally am uncomfortable speaking on behalf of any movement. I have friends who are activists and campaigners, but I don't myself feel aligned with them so much as watching them. I just mean an observer of American politics half a decade ago or 10 years ago would have looked at the scale of climate action that we've undertaken as a country under Joe Biden, and would have guessed that that was going to produce a major backlash. And in fact, when the original Green New Deal proposals came out from AOC's office, you did see like it was a big talking point on Fox News. It was part of what people talked about on the campaign trail in 2018. And to me, that's just really dissipated. And on some level, I wish that a fuller conversion had happened, and we saw much more Republican support for climate action than we've seen to this point. But I think that it counts as some amount of progress that they're basically rhetorically laying down their swords and letting the green transition, at least as it's unfolding in America's electricity sector, proceed.
How do you feel about the Vatican, or particularly Pope Francis's on climate? What role does he play, do you think, today in convincing people to think about the Earth or Earth stewardship in a different way?
Well, I find he's done a couple of large, high-profile encyclicals, one a few years ago and then one this year. I find his rhetoric and writing really moving and powerful. I find his example of concern humbling and inspiring. I don't know what the impact out in the world is, in part because he's been a divisive pope. A lot of people have, are unhappy with what a political figure he is in that place. But personally, I applaud his leadership and find the vision of his vision of integrating spiritual concerns with environmental concerns to be really powerful and moving. How do you feel?
He's my favorite pope.
Yeah.
Because I grew up Catholic, and I really appreciate when he speaks up on things. What about here in California? What would you be worried about if you were living in California on issues of climate the most, with rising sea levels or wildfires or drought, or we'll put it in maybe a perspective here, and for most people here live in the state?
Yeah, everybody worries about different things, but personally I would be most worried about wildfire, and in particular the risk of wildfire smoke. I think, in general, especially people in places like California have an understanding of where the fire risk is, although I believe it's something like half of all new homes in the state since 1990 have been built in high wildfire risk areas. We still feel like we can kind of navigate and negotiate that terrain. We know where the risk is. And even if it means, having a go bag by the door and leaving when an alarm strikes at 3 a.m., even if you didn't expect to when you went to sleep at 11 p.m. that night, we kind of know how to for the most part, navigate the risk of direct fire. But the risk of smoke is really quite scary to me. It's much more pervasive, it's not containable, it travels across not just neighborhood lines, but class lines, other demographic lines. The wind patterns are not necessarily that predictable, and the health consequences are really quite extreme. We know that air pollution in general, most of it from the burning of fossil fuels, is killing millions of people around the world each year. Wildfire smoke is contributing only a very small fraction to that, but we think probably most of the science suggests that the health impacts of wildfire smoke are proportionally worse than most of the other air pollution we have because of the stuff that gets burnt, the stuff that we're breathing in that gets burnt. We know it affects respiratory disease of all kinds, kind of intuitively, that it affects cancer risk, that it affects cardiac health, it affects dementia, Alzheimer's, it affects ADHD, it affects rates of schizophrenia, that people end up in the mental hospital more, visits the emergency room in the mental hospitals more often on days when there's high air pollution. It affects cognitive performance, it affects premature birth and low birth weight, such that when we instituted Easy Pass in America, now that you don't have to slow down at the toll plaza, you drive through, you don't produce as much exhaust around the toll plaza, and the rates of premature birth and low birth weight decline by like 15% in the immediate vicinity of those toll plazas just because of the effect of instituting Easy Pass. And this is in a country where we know that air pollution is actually, compared to the Rachel Carson days that you've been writing about, way better. And by global standards, we have really clean air in the US. And yet you can still see enough of an impact that, for instance, some researchers suggest that as many as 300 or 350,000 Americans are still dying prematurely every year from the effects of air pollution.
Absolutely.
Which is the equivalent number of people who died in 2020 from COVID.
Major, big, and important point. And in December of 1963, they did the first Clean Air Act, which went after stationary pollution. And then in 1970, Clean Air Act, that would deal with automobiles, and then the getting rid of lead out of gasoline. And what do we do now in 2024, if you like, 2025 after the election, in a state like California? How does one control this pollution from wildfires? Do we need to have a federal fire force, almost like a new branch of government? Or and what about, what's your take, I should say, on electric vehicles? There's some people that say if they're having a wildfire coming, they're worried electricity goes out and then they can't charge their car. Do you think, is there any relevancy to that fear that some people have that live in an arid part of California?
I think that should be pretty far down on your list of worries. Yeah. Especially in a place like California, when you're talking about a rapid evacuation, you're talking about evacuating, over a span of tens of miles, maybe 50 miles. And just to put that in perspective, I spent a lot of time in Canada this year, where they had an unbelievable record wildfire season, about 3 times as bad as they had ever recorded before. The burn scar so large you could fit half the world's countries inside it, just in Canada, and enough carbon released by those fires that it was 3 times Canada's annual carbon emissions just from the burning of fires. And I particularly spent time in the Northwest Territories, which is a remote part of Canada. It's about 5 times the size of California, but it has only about 40,000 residents in it. And in a period of time this summer, every single town and city in the Northwest Territories but one was under evacuation orders from wildfire. And those evacuating from the capital, Yellowknife, which was the last big place to be evacuated and the lion's share of residents there, they had to drive for 18 hours through burning forest to get to a safe haven place. So when we think about evacuation in California,
yeah, good point.
We don't have to travel that far. So if you're going 18 hours and you can't charge your car, you're in trouble. If you have to drive 50 miles, chances are your car has enough charge to get you those 50 miles. So that's one. On the bigger picture question, I think there's a lot that we can do to reduce the risk of fire the first thing we can do is to limit the amount of global temperature rise that we have. How much more arid these forests get, how much hotter they get, we can control that to some degree. But we also have to take action on the forest management side. There's an ongoing debate. I'm sure everybody in California is aware of it. How much of this is due to climate change? How much of it is due to forest management and fire prevention over many decades, which allowed this huge buildup of what fire scientists call fuel, and the rest of us know as trees, to build up. Different people take different positions on that. Personally, I think that those who are attributing it largely or entirely to forest management are overstating the case. Yeah. But both things matter, and both things matter going forward. And there are things that we can do to try to make the forests that we have healthier, even under the climate conditions that we're likely to get.
Are you comfortable with with moving to electric vehicles? I mean, Ford Motor, for example, is starting to do electric, trucks. They're not moving that well. And Tesla's hitting problems. Is it that what's the hesitation on electrics? Are you comfortable? It's incrementally connecting and nothing. Walking on water is not made in a day,
Yeah, I'm very pro EV. I think that the limitations are very few. I think they're heavier, which means that in the case of an accident, they can be more dangerous. People worry about your driving range, how long you can drive on a charge. But personally, I think that's really an overstated problem. And most of these cars are reporting now full battery charge ranges of something like 500 miles. And so the number of times that if you're driving 500 miles, you got to get gas too. So it's really not that different. On top of which, you're plugging the car into your home, which means basically you've got a gas station at your house. It's not that every time you're going to charge up your car, you have to wait for a half hour or 45 minutes at the equivalent of a gas station. That's going to happen only very rarely when you're out in the field. Most of the time, you're returning to your home and charging it there. And I was actually at a few months ago was talking to someone who works for Ford, doing he's on the commercial side, not on the consumer side, but doing EV rollout. And he says, when he talks to people about range anxiety, he asks, he does a presentation. He asks how many people in the last week took a trip of 200 miles or whatever, and everybody's hand goes up. And he says, okay, let me look at your cars. He goes into their computers on their cars, and it's like nobody had driven that far in the last week. In fact, 1% of their trips over the last month had been that far. So people are worried about that restriction, but it actually isn't nearly as concrete a problem for our current driving patterns as most of us imagine. And the rollout, it's not as fast as I would like, but I think we're setting records every year. I think that's likely to get better as the tax incentives from the IRA are really understood. We're not going to have a 100% EV fleet by 2032 or 2035, in part because we're still going to have a lot of old cars on the road. But I think when California's standard, I think, is to not have any new sales of ICEs 2030. I think they'll be ahead of the curve on that, and it may pinch a little. But if other states are putting in policies like that for 2035, I think that's quite manageable.
How many hands? How many people here have an electric vehicle? That's a pretty good amount.
Preaching to the converted, yeah.
Very, very much. Are anybody dissatisfied with their electric experience? A hand. We're not going to demonize you. We won't even remember what hand it was. So you're all happy with it. There you go.
And it really connects to what I was talking about earlier, which is these health effects. I mean, the most striking stat that I've come across about the negative health effects of the cars that we run today is that if you replace a diesel school bus, which is how most school buses operate in the US today, with an EV school bus, you cut the rates of asthma on that bus in half. This is such a win-win that the people who study air pollution say that we can entirely pay for the decarbonization of the Americans' electricity and transportation systems entirely just through the public health benefits of cleaner air. We wouldn't have to calculate the climate benefits. We wouldn't have to calculate the new jobs or the investment returns, all just about how much less it would cost us with our visits to the hospital and the doctor, how many fewer deaths and how much less illness we would be seeing. That alone would entirely pay for the entire decarbonization of the American electricity and transportation sector. And I think that that's something that very few Americans really appreciate, that we are driving these things around, we are pushing toxic exhaust out into the air, Some of that we're breathing ourselves as drivers, but also into the neighborhoods and environments that we're circling through. And all of those people are suffering as a result. We can choose to eliminate that suffering pretty rapidly when we go electric.
David, you circled around it, but we might as well, you want to nail it. How does one, I think one of the problems is whenever there's a freakish storm, people don't know whether, even in the media world, whether you're allowed to call it a climate disaster, because there have always been hurricanes, and then Biden has been under some criticism from the environmental community for not declaring things climate emergencies, the term, just again, to drive the point home. Do you have, through all the great journalism and investigatory work you're doing, do you have an index of when do we declare something a climate disaster or when we don't?
Well, I think that it's, the short answer is there's an emerging field of science called rapid attribution studies, which allows people to identify pretty quickly within the space of a few weeks how much of the intensity of a particular disaster was the result of warming, how much more likely it was made by the effects of warming. This has been led principally by a group called the World Weather Attribution Network, and its main public figure is a brilliant scientist named Frederica Otto. And so that's sort of my gold standard. And they'll tell you things like, for instance, the floods that hit Libya in the summer, destroying a dam and killing, I think the death toll was a few hundred. The deadliest flood event anywhere in the world this century was made 50 times more likely by climate change. Now, it's also a complicated disaster. A dam collapsed. There are human and political components to that. The dam was not being kept up properly. There had not been repair. People were living in dangerous places. But I think that tells us something else about climate disasters generally, which is that they are never or almost never entirely climate powered. It's about the intersection of climate challenges and human infrastructure and human decisions. And we need to think about all of those aspects in planning for a future in which the intensity of those climate threats is larger. But to say, well, we could have built that dam differently or repaired it, is not to say that climate isn't presenting a much larger challenge to Libyans than it did 10 or 20 years ago. It is. Both things are true. And so I think, while it's rarely the case that you can narrowly attribute any single climate event, any single natural disaster just to climate, I think we are living in a world in which all of these threats have been intensified, and we need to prepare for that future. And just to give a brief little spiel about that, in the really big picture, the world is already warmer than it has ever been when humans were around to walk on it. So we've already exited the window of temperatures that enclose all of human history. And all of the expectations that we've built up for infrastructure, but also for our politics and our social interactions, our psychology, our sense of seasons, and all of the complicated human activities that have risen up from human civilization over many millennia, all of that is to some degree the result of climate conditions which we've already left behind. And we are figuring out now how to live under a new set of conditions, but we know that they are much more demanding and challenging. And when I think about these changes, I actually think about the example of Houston, which was hit by 500-year storms in 5 years recently. And that term was always a little bit squishy, and right. But it reminds us, even just at a vernacular level, how much the world has changed. Because we invented the term to tell us this is a storm that we would expect to hit about once every 500 years. 500 years ago, there were no Europeans in North America. So we're talking about a storm that we would expect to hit once during that entire history, from the arrival of Europeans, the building of colonies, the waging of a genocide against the native people, the fighting of a revolution, the building of a slave empire, the fighting of a civil war, emancipation, industrialization, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the age of American empire, the end of the Cold War, the end of history, September 11th, financial crisis, COVID-19. We're talking about a storm that theoretically, according to this vernacular standard, we would expect to hit once during that entire history. And Houston got 5 of them in 5 years, which literally means they got millennia of extreme weather in half a decade. And that reminds us that, among other things, it's possible to think about climate change as having pulled us into a sort of mythological place out of a place of history, and we're going to be dealing with challenges of this scale. On the other hand, Houston's still standing. It's not like when you walk down those streets or drive those streets, you think, well, this is a wasteland. And that's a reminder that climate change is not the whole of our destiny. It's just the natural landscape on which we're going to build that future. And what choices we make about how we build that future are going to be incredibly consequential, because those challenges, those impacts, those threats are only going to be growing almost certainly throughout all of our lifetimes in this room. And we need to be much, much smarter and much more serious about navigating that future to allow future generations to navigate that landscape comfortably and happily.
Is there, just to put a bow on it, is there a referee that we can trust? Is there a way for the country to get a just like we are doing categories of hurricanes, a 1, a 2, a 3? Is there an ability, something we can all trust, to say this should constitute a climate disaster? Or do you think that kind of thinking's reductive, doesn't help, and just puts the president in a hard position to have to declare Hawaii's a climate emergency? On the other hand, how many of these 5-year Houston events, does it take? Can we create a referee? Maybe you named one that you trust. Could one that the American people believe in be created?
I think the science is solid, which means it's a matter of institutionalizing it and giving it the imprimatur of political and social buy-in. But I think it's definitely possible. From my perspective, from an analytic perspective, the distinction is not that important, because the world that we're living in today is defined by climate change. Everything that's happening in it is shaped by it. And so saying this is climate, this isn't, is in some sense splitting rhetorical hairs. But at the level of public communication and advocacy, I do think it's valuable to remind people that, yes, we just had a deadlier wildfire in Hawaii than we had in more than a century. This was the wildfire in Lahaina in Maui, the deadliest American wildfire in more than a century. And it's part of a growing trend of, you can't even really call them wildfires because they're not in the wildland. They're in densely residential neighborhoods. This was basically unheard of from the time of the Great Chicago Fire all the way through 2017, 2018. And then we started to see it. We saw it in Santa Rosa in California. The fire isn't going from tree to tree. It's going from house to house. We saw it in Paradise, California. Same thing. We saw it in Boulder, Colorado. And now we saw it in Lahaina. We've also seen it in parts of Canada. A lot of climate scientists I know talk about this as the return of the urban firestorm. It's not even the wildfire per se that's worrying. It's the urban firestorm. When the fire starts and then jumps into town and uses the built environment as fuel. We used to think the built environment was resistant to fuel, in part because of how it was resistant to burning, in part because of how it was built. But these fires are now often burning so much hotter and more intensely that they'll pull up much more as fuel, burning so intensely that in California, I've had the scientists at CAL FIRE tell me, it burns so hot that it turns the silica in the soil into glass just by burning through. It creates huge weather systems, pyrocumulonimbus clouds, which are basically fire lightning storms, which can then start new fires miles away. In Canada this year, fires jumped a lake that was 2.5 miles across. And the embers were so big and so hot flying across that lake that they showed up on NASA satellites. Yeah. So if you can't trust a 2.5 mile body of water to protect you from a fire, you're in a tough spot. And that's sort of the future that we're heading into, is where we're going to have to start thinking in new ways about our own vulnerabilities and risks, and not take for granted things like, a modern building won't burn, or a giant lake was going to protect us. All of these rules are changing, and we're just starting to kind of wake up to that.
And in that regard, maybe calling things a climate emergency works. I mean, because of a visual component. If the 1969, Cuyahoga River on fire, people see a river on fire, and photography, it wakes you up. Santa Barbara oil spill, color television, all of the gook and the goo killing Paradise in Santa Barbara. Can we start? What I'm suggesting is maybe if we could know that that's a climate emergency, it just might stimulate a new group of people thinking,
Yeah, I mean, the way that I think about it is actually related to our somewhat disagreement about the politics of climate change earlier, which is, unfortunately, a lot of the language of climate change has just been gotten so loaded that you talk to pretty conservative Republicans and you talk about oh, the weather patterns are changing, you talk about their flood risks, you talk about the effect on their crops, they'll agree with you. But when you bring in the language of climate change, it makes it a little bit harder.
That's very true.
But I would put the question back to you, which is, learning from especially the lessons of, the early environmental movement of the 1960s, learning from, Rachel Carson, the Cuyahoga River, the Foundation at Earth Day, the EPA, all that history. What marks that period as different from ours in terms of the public receptiveness?
I think your book's done as well as about anybody, and Elizabeth Kolber, but books had a different credence. A book like Silent Spring can move needles, or Ralph Nader, Unsafe at Any Speed, or Edward Abbey's Desert Solitaire in a different kind of way. I think it's visual, Sense and Inconvenient Truth, and it's a visual medium. Doris Kearns Goodwin, I don't know if she's here right now, but Doris and I would go see President Obama quite a bit. I did the oral histories of the climate people from the Obama administration for Columbia.
Yeah.
And we would,
really interesting work.
Yeah, but and President Obama would constantly be worried about the visual component. Like, it's so big for all the things you're talking. How does one, in a visual age, show it? And he ended up going to Alaska and holding a fish, or you're showing a glacier melting. It's such a large problem. I think that in the 60s you can still get away with the documentary film a little bit, the books. That's what I mean. Maybe pop culture has to lean in. I'm not convinced, if Joe Biden has this climate record, that not getting the climate activists to say, don't quit saying he's too old or something, combine at a Biden rally and say he did do enough, and we're going to move the political needle a little bit forward. But let me ask you, in our very limited time, about in climate action, in the term, and environmental justice issues. Tell me about who's paying the worst, in your mind, brunt of what's going on now? Is it in the world even? But who is going to be profoundly affected? Where somebody might have a house that gets here, but they can move there because they have, resources.
Most of the work that's been done in this area shows that the country in the world that is expected to be hit hardest by climate damages is India. And what's most striking about this is that the calculations are mostly done by economists, and they're tallied up in dollar figures. And that matters because the value of property, and indeed the value of life, unfortunately, is not nearly as high in India as it is in the US. So when you talk about India towering over the damages that we're going to experience, you really have to multiply that many times over. If they're really getting 5 times as much damage as the US is getting, on some calculated in dollar terms, on some level that means they're getting 50 times as much damage as we're likely to expect. And in fact, you can trace this with some pretty systematic clarity. The Biden EPA recently instituted a new version of what's called the social cost of carbon, which is our estimate for the damages that are imposed on the world by every additional ton of carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere. Under Obama, it was valued at about $40 a ton. Trump cut it to $8. Biden first bumped it back up to 50, which is basically just inflation adjusted 40, and then he raised it to, it's officially 190, but it's in outdated dollars, so it's like $220 per ton right now. And what that means is that every single year right now, American emissions are doing almost $1 trillion in damage. This is not some fringe advocacy calculation. This is literally the position of the Biden EPA, that our carbon emissions are annually imposing $1 trillion of damage every year. And almost all of that, depending on how you want to parse it out, maybe even more than all of it, is imposed elsewhere. So it may be the case that the US is still, in an aggregate level, benefiting from global warming because more places are heating up and that are cold than are hot, whatever. But generally speaking, the lion's share, at least, of the damage that we're doing in the world is being imposed elsewhere. And the biggest sufferer is India, and probably secondarily across sub-Saharan Africa. And you can put dollar figures on this, and they are really quite astounding. So some economists I know, including some who have worked in the Biden administration, recently put out a paper in which they said that the US already owes well over or hundreds of billions of dollars in climate damages to India. And as the next few decades unfold, that number will grow well into the trillions.
We're running, we have just a little bit of time, so we'll kind of lightning round a couple of quick things so we can have a kind of quick answer on a few, if possible. Coal. Is it something that we should be just getting rid of in the United States? Yes.
And everywhere.
And everywhere.
For every 1,000 people that get power from coal, one person dies every year from air pollution.
Where, as a reporter for the New York Times, are you finding people doing the most interesting climate-related research? Either a think tank, institute, university. Where are you impressed?
Well, I think the World Weather Attribution people are doing really important work tying events immediately to climate. I think that the work on air pollution that's being done at the University of Chicago and the Climate Impact Lab and also at Harvard is really, really powerful. And then I think there's a lot of economic work that's really important because it's so close to public policy that's being done at Stanford and Berkeley. And hopefully has already shaken the economic consensus of a decade ago that the transition will be burdensome and expensive, and shown the world that in fact we will be more prosperous the faster we move. Policy doesn't yet quite show that, but the fact that we're moving as quickly as we are now to decarbonize shows that more and more people are waking up to that reality, and I think that's largely to the credit of some climate-focused economists.
You were at a book festival, you worked for the Times, and you wrote a book that's a standard must-read book, honestly. Please get it. But yeah, truly. But I'm curious, what books influenced you on your environmental journey, and ones that, did it start with early Bill McKibben, or how did you start really navigating to be at the point where you're at with literature writing?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, I came to this late, so I worked with you I was an editorial assistant at Times Books when they were doing the President's Series, and I also worked with Bill McKibben in that same job as one of my first jobs out of college on one of his books called Enough. I'd heard of The End of Nature then, but I hadn't read it. Those books were very important, obviously very important to me. But I actually came to the subject more from the humanities. And I wondered if this is truly, the meta-narrative of our time that touches everything in the same way that, say, human rights governed geopolitics coming out of World War II, or neoliberalism governed the dynamics of the markets after the end of the Cold War, and climate change is sort of a force like that shaping everything. How do we develop a new set of analytic tools that are not derived from the legacy of environmental writing, as important and powerful as that is, but are derived from other fields, helping us think about what it means to live psychologically in a time we perceive as apocalyptic, even if it's not truly apocalyptic, or how we think about the ethics in a time of dramatic climate change, what we owe people elsewhere in the world. And in that sense, I think I'm indebted as much as anything to people like Peter Singer, who really emphasize the common humanity of everyone who's alive on the planet and teach us or suggest, I think, that we should be thinking of climate change as a moral tutor, reminding us that the life of someone living in sub-Saharan Africa or in Bangladesh or India is not worth less than our own just because they are distant from us. In fact, because we are in many ways, as the most prosperous country in the world, responsible for the most emissions historically, to some degree we are imposing burdens on them directly, and we should be thinking about that obligation, that responsibility, and ultimately that guilt in a much more direct and profound way than I think almost any American does today.
A brilliant way to end. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.